In the last lecture, we looked closely at Aristotle's philosophy of nature adopted by Thomas Aquinas, a philosophical teaching that culminated in the doctrine of the four causes: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. As it happens, Aristotle's and Aquinas' philosophy of human nature, or what is often today called their philosophical anthropology, builds squarely upon their more general philosophy of nature. This is simply because Aristotle and Aquinas both understand human beings as parts of the natural world, albeit very unique parts. And so we may go about understanding ourselves by using many of the same categories by which we understand the world around us. Maybe the best way to approach the philosophy of human nature is to consider that philosophy against the backdrop of a contemporary debate. Most modern philosophers tend to describe the human person according to one of two theories: materialism on the one hand, and dualism on the other. First, let's look at materialism. As we've already seen in Lecture 2, this point of view is as old as philosophy itself, since the earliest philosophers predominantly attempted to account for all of reality by exclusive appeal to some material principle or other, whether water, air, atoms, or something else. As a philosophical anthropology, materialism is nothing more than the claim that material causes and principles alone can account for all human phenomena. To be sure, materialists have the most difficult time providing a materialistic explanation for the higher cognitive functions of human nature, such as consciousness, free choice, and cognitive thought. But in the end, the materialist account, by definition, must be that, however difficult these things might be to explain, they all can or must be explained by reference to brain activity. In the words of the scientist and materialist Marvin Minsky, the mind simply is what the brain does. But is materialism philosophically plausible? To be sure, it's had many proponents in the history of philosophy, including Democritus, Thomas Hobbes, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and most recently, Alex Rosenberg. Perhaps one reason it's so appealing is the appearance of a kind of hard-nosed realism, or its strict adherence to Occam's razor, by striving not to multiply causes beyond what is absolutely necessary to explain a set of phenomenon, in this case, the phenomenon of human mental activity. On the other hand, materialism seems to have a steep uphill climb, for the thoughts of human beings inherently seem to defy a materialistic explanation. Consider, for example, the following quotation from C.S. Lewis. "If everything is material," he argued, quote, "this also holds for the thoughts of the materialists, as well as for anyone else's. But if their thoughts are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give me a correct account of all other accidents. It's like expecting that the accidental shape taken by the splash when you upset a milk jug should give you a correct account of how the jug was made, and why it was upset." End of quote. Lewis's point in this passage is much more fully developed by the contemporary Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga in a very well-known essay entitled Against Materialism. As Plantinga argues, materialism entails the claim that all beliefs held in the minds of human beings can be nothing more than arrangements of material parts, for instance, neurons. But regardless of how complex those arrangements of neurons might become, as materialistic arrangements of neurons, they will never have something that thoughts and beliefs of human beings appear to have by definition. And this is what Plantinga calls content. As he explains, quote, "And now the difficulty for materialism is this. How does it happen, or how can it be, that an assemblage of neurons, a group of material objects firing away has any content. How can that happen? More poignantly, what is it for such an event to have content? What is it for this structured group of neurons, or the event of which they are a part, to be related, for example, to the proposition, Cleveland is a beautiful city, in such a way that the latter is its content? End of quote. What's so powerful about Plantinga's argument is that he's not just saying that neuroscience has yet to provide a materialistic explanation of how our ideas have content. It's rather that the very notion of content just defies any materialistic explanation a neuroscientist or any scientist might give now or ever. As he continues, quote, "It's not just that we don't know or can't see how it's done. When light strikes photoreceptor cells in the retina, there is an enormously complex cascade of electrical activity, resulting in an electrical signal to the brain. I have no idea how all that works, but of course I know it happens all the time. But in the case under consideration, that is, how arrangements of neurons could have content, is different. Here, it's not merely that I don't know how physical interaction among neurons brings it about that an assemblage of them has content and is a belief. No, in this case, it seems upon reflection that such an event could not have content. It's like trying to understand what it would be for the number 7, for example, to weigh 5 pounds, or for an elephant, or the unit set of an elephant, to be a proposition. We can't see how that could happen. More exactly, we can see that it couldn't happen. A number just isn't the sort of thing that can have weight. There is no way in which that number or any other number could weigh anything at all. Similarly, we can see, I think, that physical activity among neurons can't constitute content. There they are, those neurons, clicking away, sending electrical impulses hither and yon. But what has this to do with content? How is content, or aboutness, supposed to arrive from this neural activity? How can such a thing possibly be a belief? But then no neural event can as such have content, can be about something, in the same way in which my belief that the number 7 is prime, or my belief that the oak tree in my backyard is without leaves, is about that oak tree. End of quote. Closely connected to the problem of content is the materialist's inability to explain the truth or falsity of our beliefs. If the thoughts and beliefs in our minds are in fact nothing more than arrangements of neurons, or some most basic elementary parts of neurons, it makes no sense whatsoever to say that our beliefs are true or false. Just as weight and color don't apply to things like numbers or geometrical figures, truth and falsity simply doesn't apply to arrangements of neurons. It makes no sense to say that one person's arrangement of neurons is true and another's is false. If, however, the beliefs located in one's brain are nothing other than arrangements of neurons, as the materialist holds, it follows that, on materialism, there can be no such thing as a true or false belief. And yet consistency demands that the materialist would have to apply this to his own belief in materialism. And so it follows that if materialism is true, then it can't be true, because no belief or set of beliefs can be true. Once we begin to think through its implications, therefore, materialism quickly descends into incoherence. It is precisely this incoherence that has led other philosophers to embrace dualism, or the belief that the human mind is, in fact, a separate substance from the human body, including the human brain. The most famous dualist was the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes, who argued that because human thinking cannot be explained at all materialistically, The human mind must be conceived strictly as a thinking thing, related in some way but distinct from the human body. The problem for Descartes, however, is that there is clearly a profound interaction between the body and the mind, which this strong statement of their separation has great difficulty explaining. More specifically, bodily actions and events clearly cause things to happen in the mind. Seeing geometrical shapes represented on paper or a chalkboard can cause one to think of actual geometrical shapes and the theorems that govern them in one's mind. A serious blow to the head can make it difficult for one's mind to think clearly about anything, as can happen with other physical events such as drunkenness, drug use, or simply falling asleep. Likewise, in the other direction, certain mental actions and events can cause bodily movements, as when one's thinking about the best course of action leads people physically to move their bodies in executing that action. Or when pondering the nature of a mathematical proof can cause one verbally to explain that proof to a student. And yet, if the mind and body are really two distinct substances, one material and the other immaterial, it becomes extremely difficult to explain how these causal interactions are possible. It certainly cannot be in the same manner as one physical thing causes another physical thing to move, as when one billiard ball strikes another. Nor can it be after the manner of purely immaterial mental causation, as when contemplating the nature of a triangle causes one to realize the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. These problems are precisely the reason that both materialism and dualism are rejected by the Thomistic and Aristotelian traditions in philosophy. According to Aristotle and Aquinas, the human person is neither a strictly physical or bodily thing, nor a separate immaterial mind that mysteriously interacts with the body. Aristotle's and Aquinas' account of human nature, in point of fact, lies between these two extremes. As Aristotle would argue, the best way to account for human nature is by using the principles of nature in general. And what this means first and foremost is that the best way to understand the human soul is to see it as the form, or the formal cause, of the human body. What this means is that, like all natural things, the human person is one thing, or one substance, with both a material dimension and an immaterial dimension. Otherwise stated, the human person is neither strictly a body, nor a mind that is housed in a body, but is rather best described as a body-soul composite. Aristotle's and Aquinas' position, therefore, avoids the problems with materialism, because they affirm that the human being is, in fact, partly immaterial. And it also avoids the problems with dualism, because the human being, on their account, remains one thing. Just as the form of a tree is the tree's treeness, that serves as the organizing principle of the tree's material parts, and makes those parts to be parts of a particular kind of thing, namely a tree, so also the soul of the human person is nothing other than the humanity of this particular person's body. Speaking precisely, therefore, Aristotle and Aquinas would never say that a human being's soul knows things or chooses things. On the contrary, it is the human person himself or herself that knows or chooses. And he or she is able to know or choose precisely because he or she possesses a human soul. It would be a mistake, however, to identify the human soul only with those higher cognitive functions of rational thought and free choice. For Aristotle and Aquinas, the human soul possesses 3 levels of powers that are only possible because of the human person's immaterial dimension. These 3 levels are, firstly, the soul's vegetative powers, which include nutrition, growth, and reproduction. Secondly, the soul's sensitive powers, which include the five senses, plus what Aquinas calls our interior senses, like imagination and memory. Only after fully understanding these bottom layers of the soul's powers may we fully appreciate its highest powers, namely those of our rational faculty. As Aristotle would argue, it is impossible to account for the human being's ability to metabolize food, grow, or reproduce simply as a collection of material parts. Even these functions, however strictly physical they may seem, presuppose a formal principle that is not simply reducible to matter. One contemporary Aristotelian philosopher, Leon Kass, makes this point with particular clarity. As he explains, quote, "It is the activity of metabolism itself that should make it clear that the materials do not by themselves even begin to account for the phenomenon of life. Yes, the organism is perishable. Yes, the properties of its materials are in part responsible for its workings and character. But, as we ourselves know best from the inside, and precisely because of our constant need to eat and to replenish our bodily stuff, the living animal has a unity and a self-identity that in fact outlasts its ever-shifting material. Over the course of a lifetime of metabolizing, the organism persists, though its materials do not. Metabolism means the continuous exchange of stuff between inside and out, and no molecule in the organism is immune to turnover. Thus, the organism is never the same materially, yet it persists as the same being, and indeed precisely by means of exchanging its materials. But what then is it that persists? Among other things, the organism's boundedness and separation from all else beyond its border, and its wholeness and identity, both species-specific and individual, within. Persisting, too, is the internal organization and the functional harmony among the parts. Most important, persisting are the organic powers and activities, including the powers and the activities of self-persistence, that is, metabolism itself, maintenance of the self, by the self, and for the self, always exerted and directed against a largely indifferent world of otherness, and against the impending negation that is death. In short, what persists is form, integrated, specific, individuated, empowered, and efficacious organization." End of quote. What Kass's explanation implies, of course, is that human beings are not the only things with souls. In fact, anything that may rightly be described as alive, anything that eats, grows, and reproduces, technically has a soul with at least this basic set of vegetative powers. And this would include plants as well as animals. No plant, however, possesses any of the second-level animate powers, which are what Aristotle and Aquinas call the sensitive powers. As mentioned, these include not only the five exterior senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, but also the interior senses, an example of which is imagination, or the ability of a cognitive agent to envision something perceived by the exterior sense in, so to speak, the mind's eye. When I close my eyes and envision my daughter's face, in other words, I am using the interior sense of imagination. In an even more obvious way, as in the soul's vegetative functions, the ability to sense implies an immaterial principle in the one sensing. To be sure, sensation, like the vegetative powers, is partly a physical process. One does not feel heat on one's hand without the hand actually getting hot, and the physical apparatus of the central nervous system reacting in a certain way. And yet these physical movements or changes is not the same thing as feeling heat. An extremely complex robot might be built to quickly pull its hand off a hot burner when it comes into contact with extreme heat. And yet the robot would not feel the heat. It would not have the subjective experience, in other words, of the pain in its hand as an animate being would have. Why is this so? According to Aristotle, it would be for no other reason than that the robot does not have a soul as humans and many other animals do. This finally leads to the highest powers of the soul, which among natural things are unique to human beings. This is what Aristotle and Aquinas call the rational faculty of the human soul. Whereas other animals are capable of sensation and even imagination, only humans are capable of reasoning, which in fact is the basis for defining the human being precisely as the rational animal. But what exactly does it mean to be rational? According to Aristotle and Aquinas, the first clue to understanding the answer to this question is to see the difference between the higher sensitive power of imagination and the formation of universal mental concepts. So, for example, it is one thing to see the representation of a triangle on a chalkboard. It is yet another thing to imagine a triangle in my mind's eye. What's distinctive, says Aquinas, about these two cognitive actions is particularity. With my eyes, I can only see this or that particular triangle. Even at the level of imagination, although it might be a little more hazy and without so many details, I can still only imagine a particular triangle. The triangle in my imagination will be either equilateral, scalene, obtuse, isosceles, one color or another, etc. Those mental actions, however, are sharply distinguished from the conceptualization of a triangle, or better still, triangularity. It is one thing to imagine a triangle, and yet quite another to consider it as a concept, the nature of triangularity itself. What makes this conceptualization distinctive is that the concept is no longer particular as the sense-experienced or imagined triangles were. Once I abstract the idea of a triangle, my new concept is universal, which means it may apply to any particular triangle. Again, this power of abstracting is precisely the mark of a rational animal, and what distinguishes human beings from the rest of the animal kingdom. It is, of course, not only the concepts of geometrical figures that we can hold in our minds and rationally contemplate, but many other abstract concepts, such as humanity, justice, equality, goodness, and friendship. More than anything else, the rational faculty demonstrates the immaterial dimension of the human soul. Whatever is physical or material is by definition particular. Whether we're talking about an aircraft carrier that can be seen with our eyes, or a microscopic neuron in our brain, a moment's reflection reveals that a physical thing must necessarily be a particular thing. If the human person were strictly material or physical, if the mind truly was nothing more than what the brain did, as Marvin Minsky argued, the conceptualization of universal ideas would be just impossible. As strictly material things, our intellects would be confined to the realm of the particular. The fact that we have the ability to consider universals, however, demonstrates that our minds must necessarily transcend the physicality of mere brain activity. But here we must be careful not to go too far. On Aristotle's and Aquinas' account, this observation must not lead us to the dualist conclusion that the human intellect or mind is some kind of separate substance from the body, as Descartes believed. On the contrary, The human intellect is nothing other than the power of the human soul, which is in turn the form of the human body. The human person is, therefore, a single substance, a body-soul composite, with rational powers, the function of which transcend matter in a particularly remarkable way. There are many implications of the Aristotelian Thomistic teaching about the nature of the human being and the relationship between the body and the soul. But it would be especially helpful to focus upon just three. First, according to the Aristotelian and Thomistic account of human nature, the activity of the human intellect, while distinct from the operation of sensation, nevertheless depends upon a prior act of sensation. Recall that the conceptualization of universal concepts is fundamentally a process of abstraction. From the perception of many particular triangles, therefore, the human intellect is able to abstract the concept of triangularity. From the perception of many human beings, the human intellect is able to abstract the universal concept of humanity, and so on with the other concepts of the mind. In short, the human intellect needs the content of the senses before it has anything from which to abstract universal ideas. According to Aristotle and Aquinas, experience just shows that human beings do not possess any innate ideas, as Descartes had argued. We possess, rather, the ability to abstract universal ideas from our sense experience. Ideas which then become the basis of our intellectual lives as we form judgments, reason from premises to conclusions, and even philosophize. Secondly, according to Aristotle's and Aquinas' position, human knowledge can be had about things in the physical external world. This is because, ordinarily, the abstracted concepts in our souls are not that which we know, but are rather that by which we know. For example, having the concept of mammal in my intellect allows me to know the furry, fleshy, warm-blooded animals I encounter in the world as mammals. On this account, I'm able to abstract the concept of mammal from my sense experience of the mammals themselves, and then by means of that concept, come to understand what those mammals in fact are. So again, the concepts in my mind are not the direct objects of my knowledge, but are what my mind uses to know things outside of itself. This is precisely how knowledge of the external world on the Aristotelian and Thomistic view is truly possible, and how their account of human knowing avoids the skepticism so common to other philosophies. The final implication is an important one. Remember that Aristotle and Aquinas' position is that the human intellect is not a separate thing, but is rather a power of the soul that is the form of the human body. Understood as such, it would be wrong to say that the human intellect knows things. Having abstracted the concept of triangularity, it's not my intellect that understands this concept. It is rather I who understand this concept. This is because the intellect is not a separate thing. It is instead nothing other than a power of my soul. And not even my soul is the same thing as me. So it is not my intellect that comes to understand things, nor even my soul that does so. It is, to put the matter precisely, I that come to understand things by means of the intellectual powers of my soul, which in turn is the substantial form of my body. Again, we arrive back at the middle position of Aristotle and Aquinas, between the erroneous extremes of materialism and dualism, the teaching that the human person is neither a body nor a soul, but a body-soul composite. Only this nuanced view, can account for the complex nature of the human person, who is both rational and animal, both intellectual and bodily, both physical and spiritual.